One moment, this man was conducting a farewell ceremony for a woman's late husband, and the very next, he became involved with the widow. In his words, this was God's way of comforting the widow for her loss. He is Hemund, the warrior bishop of the Sherborne Diocese in Wessex. It seems England has finally introduced a character with flair. The story picks up right where the last episode left off. Ivar, having lost his sanity, murders his own brother over a petty argument, an act that is unforgivable to many. Filled with guilt, Ivar admits to his grave mistake and swears it wasn't intentional. He was blinded by rage. After apologizing to everyone, Ivar leaves the room. Truth be told, Sigurd has always ridiculed and mocked Ivar for his disability, a fact known to all, and they couldn't justify killing Ivar just for Sigurd's sake. However, Ub insists that the temperamental Ivar cannot lead, but Bjorn has lost interest in meddling. Once ready, Bjorn and Halfdan embark on their Mediterranean journey, after successively losing his daughter, Ragnar, and Helga. Floki's heart was completely shattered. Now that Ragnar's death has been avenged, he sees no reason to stay and decides to set out on a purposeless voyage alone. Now, only the three brothers remain as leaders in England. Ub suggests dividing East Anglia to settle and farm the land. Ivar still wants to take advantage of the situation and continue the attack. He wants to establish a permanent stopover on the coast, so that it will be easy to go to England or back to Norway. This would allow them to secure their foothold once again. He sets his sights on York in the northeast, drawn by its rivers and proximity to the coast. This time Hvitserk agreed with Ivar's decision. After all, they were in a position where they could easily be attacked from the back. A few days later, they arrive outside York. Ub recalls his father mentioning that during the Feast of Saints, people are either in church praying or deeply inebriated, making it the most opportune time for an attack. Then, learning from the children that the Ascension of Christ is in 3 days, Ivar decides that's when they'll strike York. Meanwhile, Hemund arrives in a pillaged Wessex, where they rebuild the ruined town and hold a funeral for King Ecbert. Hemund also learns of Ecbert's succession and his schemes from witnesses and decides to seek out the new king, Ethelwulf.
Then Ethelwulf is king, and the grant of land worthless. Yes.
Before leaving, Hemund takes an interest in a woman attending mass. Afterwards, feeling ashamed, Hemund strips naked and walks through thorns, allowing them to pierce every inch of his skin as penance for his actions.
Please forgive me, three-person God. Punish me. Ravish me!
Currently, Ethelwulf is taking refuge in the marshes, clearly living in harsh conditions. Alfred shows his frail constitution. Ever since fleeing from Hvitserk, he's been bedridden, his face covered in dark spots. The nature of his illness unknown, but since he's the future father of England, these ailments will surely pass. This marks the Vikings' first brutal assault on an English town, a massacre that would be remembered for its sheer brutality. Their goal was to capture York, a major town in Northumbria, to establish a forward base in England from which they could advance or retreat at will. On the day of the siege, Ub was in charge of taking the city walls. Just as Ub had predicted, on the Feast of the Saints, most people were off praying and celebrating, leaving only a few sentinels on the walls. Facing almost no resistance, Ub easily took control of the city gates. The excitement of these Vikings was like a group of sharks that had smelled blood after a long hunger. When the Vikings reached the church, the devout worshippers inside were completely unaware of the chaos unfolding outside. Not even God told them they were about to be slaughtered like lambs. Ub did not kill these unarmed civilians. In this aspect, he was much like Ragnar, but the others couldn't care less. In minutes, the Christians' heaven turned into hell. A nun, to avoid being defiled by these demons, took her own life by cutting her wrists. Ivar showed his brutal side by grabbing the bishop and melting his crucifix before brutally pouring gold into the archbishop's mouth. What Ivar did was indeed brutal, but it also showed his hatred of Christianity. His father was too much of a believer in Christians, which led him to that fate. But that's not all. Ivar had the bishop chained to a horse and paraded around as a warning to the people not to go against him. Ub was the first to disagree with Ivar, thinking him too extreme. He also reminded Ivar not to forget Sigurd's death. Meanwhile, Harald, full of anticipation, returned to Kattegat, unaware that Egil's mission had failed. Only when Harald saw Lagertha still firmly seated on the throne did he realize his mistake, but it was too late. He had no choice but to report on the situation in England while feigning calm. It wasn't until Harald finished his report that Lagertha exposed his true nature.
And I thought that perhaps you wanted to find out how well Egil the Bastard had served you. Perhaps you expected to find him here, sat upon the throne, keeping it warm for you.
Harald didn't deny Lagertha's accusations, so it was only natural that he should pay for his behavior. After a severe beating, Harald told Lagertha what was in his heart. He had aspired to be king of Norway to impress a woman, not out of spite for Lagertha. Now that the woman was dead, he would no longer attack Kattegat. Harald proposed an alliance, suggesting that since he lacked a woman and Lagertha a man, a marriage between them could solidify her position.
Do you really think, King Harald, that I would prostrate myself at your feet and offer thanks to the gods that you would deem to be my husband? Grateful for you that you would offer to come to my bed in all your glory.
Harald was right about Lagertha not having a man for too long, but as a queen she couldn't let her enemies find her weakness so easily. But this was the perfect opportunity for her to let off some steam. The next morning, several women argued over Harald's proposal. Astrid didn't trust the ambitious man, but Lagertha thought it worth considering. As Lagertha's lover, Astrid naturally opposed the marriage, storming out of the room in anger. But Astrid was right. How could Harald give up his claim to the throne? Just as Lagertha let her guard down, Harald had already escaped, and he had kidnapped Astrid. Why did Harald kidnap Astrid? And how would Lagertha respond upon finding out?
They've gone. Who's gone? King Harald and his men. Their boats have gone. They freed him and killed some of the guards.
Where's Astrid?
Astrid.
Ivar plans to sacrifice this beautiful woman before the big battle, but instead of fearing her fate, she tells him she's willing to do anything for him.
Then take off your clothes.
Alfred finally gets out of bed, but the first thing he does is sleepwalk. That day, he was drawn to a dark figure, and when he saw his true colors, Alfred fainted. After being rescued and brought ashore, a foul liquid bursts from his mouth. But once it's all out, he's much clearer-headed. Alfred tells Ethelwulf they must go to York because the people there are in dire straits.
But how? How do you know?
My father told me.
He says the shadowy figure was his biological father, Athelstan. So, they set out for York, guided by the saint. Soon, they arrive outside the city of York. Coincidentally, just as Hemund, who had arrived earlier, is also there. The bishop finally meets his new king. After a brief exchange, Hemund begins to report to Ethelwulf. York is a building left over from the Roman Empire. Several of the stones in the walls have started to loosen over the years, something the Vikings hadn't noticed, so there was a chance to break through. However, Hemund advocates for patience, suggesting they wait for more troops and conduct further reconnaissance before making a decision. Hemund's forcefulness is a bit overbearing, and he seems to have no regard for the new king, as he's the one who's giving the orders. Meanwhile, Harald has returned to his kingdom, along with Astrid, whom he had kidnapped. Harald wants Astrid to be his queen, promising her the title of Queen of all Norway once he conquers it. Astrid doesn't respond to Harald's proposal.
You know I want to make this town the capital of Norway. It has always been my dream. This woman is Astrid. She is part of my dream.
It is clear that Astrid does not like this place or Harald, but seeing how the crowds are flocking to their king, she is beginning to see Harald in a different light. After many days of wandering, Floki's supplies were running low and his raven was down to its last one. Then Floki was unlucky enough to be caught in a storm. The sight of a lone boat on the vast ocean perfectly captures the Vikings' spirit of exploration. After an unknown span of time, Floki's ship finally made landfall on a beach. Floki the Crow was the first person in history to discover and name Iceland. He was called the Raven Man because Viking explorers were skilled at using ravens to find land. When Floki set sail, he brought along 3 ravens. The release of these ravens if they did not return indicated the presence of land in that direction. Thus, the land Floki landed on is very likely to be Iceland. Unlike other lands, the beaches here are black and the ground is covered with moss-covered volcanic rock. After Floki crossed the mountains and saw volcanoes, waterfalls, hot springs and rivers, he saw many unexplained miracles. For example, his hands suddenly recovered from paddling, and he saw humanoid deities, all of which made him think that the land beneath him was the land of the gods. Floki plans to return to Kattegat to bring people to settle here. Back in York, Ivar receives news of the English forces gathering. Before the battle, he plans a sacrifice. His men bring a beautiful slave, but Freydis is unafraid of Ivar, even knowing she's to be sacrificed. She expresses her willingness to do anything for him.
Then take off your clothes.
Freydis' willingness to sacrifice herself left Ivar at a loss, but her words that followed boosted his confidence even more.
I know you're a cripple, boneless, but let me tell you something. Your deformity means that the gods favor you, especially. I've always known that. I always look for people who are born different. You are destined for great things.
Her words not only save her life but also grant her freedom. She is the second woman to be so sure of Ivar, so could she be the woman of his destiny? Can Ethelwolf, with Haemund's help, successfully take York? See you in the next episode.
Tomorrow we attack York.
And may God be with us.
At dawn, the English forces entered York through a breach in the city walls. They thought their plan was flawless, but Ivar had anticipated their move. He knew about the wall's vulnerability and left it unpatched deliberately to lure the enemy into a trap. Now, Ethelwolf, thinking he had victory in his grasp, even brought his 2 precious sons to the battlefield. The troops were quickly assembled, with Ethelwolf and Haemund leading separate detachments toward the inner city. But as the soldiers advanced into the alleys, thick smoke obscured their vision. Hesitating in the smog, they were suddenly struck by a volley of arrows. Guessing the enemy's numbers to be few, Ethelwolf immediately pursued, only for the Vikings to block the alley's entrance with barriers. It was then the English realized the enemy was well prepared. As archers from the 2nd floor began their relentless assault, Ethelwolf knew that they had been tricked and told everyone to get out of the area, but they didn't notice the spiked traps that had been set up at the exit, and a few of the soldiers who had been in the lead were pierced through, with arrows raining down and traps at their feet. They were caught in a deadly snare, so they switched to the next exit, but all the intersections can be set up traps. Dense spikes through the body of the generals. The screams were endless. With no other choice, Ethelwolf had to step on the bodies of his own soldiers trapped in the spikes to make their escape. These soldiers, who might not have died otherwise, were trampled to death by their comrades, a brutal reality of war. The English, like headless flies, scrambled within the city, while Ivar quietly admired his handiwork from the bell tower. Haemund faced a similar fate, only to encounter fireworks as an additional peril. Seeing the enemy in disarray, Fitzurk led a charge, and a melee ensued. As a son of Ragnar, Fitzurk was no less brave than the rest, but he was more reserved and less decisive. After all, he does not have the experience of Bjorn, nor the strength of Ub, nor the wisdom of Ivar, but Fitzurk is the one who cherishes the brotherhood the most.
Come on and fight! You coward!
Ethelwolf's provocation was successful. Emotions, Ivar's greatest weakness, got the better of him, and unable to withstand the insults, he rushed to the main battlefield. But midway, a soldier struck Ivar off his chariot with a thick stick, marking Ivar's first fall in battle. When the soldier was about to kill Ivar, Ivar quickly got up and killed him back. The furious Ivar slashed 13 times. Blood splattered all over his face. As Ivar returned to his chariot, a group of English soldiers arrived, suspecting this bloodied crawler might be the devil incarnate. Miraculously, their arrows missed Ivar. Ivar also saw the enemy's fear and played a psychological game.
Verstryker floren! Ikke meg med det bollen! Ikke meg med det bollen! Du kan drive meg! Ikke meg med det bollen!
Ivar not only shocked the enemy, but also Ub, who didn't even try to save Ivar first. Perhaps deep down, Ub harbored a fleeting wish for Ivar's death. Given his fearsome presence, after much deliberation, Ub chose to charge. Prince Ethelred, inheriting his father's valor, but he was soon pierced in the shoulder by a cold arrow. The warrior bishop, Hemund, displayed unmatched bravery, wielding his sword to decimate numerous foes. His sacred blade cut through iron as if it were butter, easily warding off enemy attacks. Vikings have always admired the strong, so Ivar admired Hemund too, but no matter how strong Hemund was, it didn't matter. Ethelwulf was already retreating with Ethelred, who had been hit by an arrow. They had a poor start, marking Ethelwulf's second defeat to Ivar. The victorious Vikings did not celebrate grandly, as they too had suffered many casualties. Ub and Ivar disagreed on their next move. Ub felt that he could use the victory to negotiate terms. He still wanted to claim East Anglia. Ivar, on the other hand, had no intention of negotiating, as he felt it was not the Vikings' style to offer peace. Under the cover of night, Ub secretly woke Fitzurk to negotiate with Ethelwulf without Ivar knowing. After stating their purpose, Ethelwulf allowed them to rest in the camp for a night before giving a response. However, Hemund ambushed their tent, killing Ub and Hvitserk's attendants and then brutally beating Ub. Luckily, Hemund left Ub and Hvitserk alive, as they had come to negotiate. Ub and Hvitserk's plight was scorned by Ivar, who thought they lacked intelligence. Ivar believed that the joint rule of the three brothers was doomed to fail. He seized this opportunity to win over the hearts of the people and consolidate power all to himself. As the elder brother, Ub refused to be led by Ivar, deciding to return to Kattegat with Hvitserk. Before setting sail, the indecisive Hvitserk changed his mind, choosing to continue fighting alongside Ivar. The moment Hvitserk jumped from the ship, Ub's heart shattered. Realizing he was the one abandoned, Hvitserk could not foresee how this choice would lead to profound regret.
You see, everyone is with me.
Bjorn arrived at the entrance to the Mediterranean once again, this time accompanied by the wanderer Sinrik. Sinrik informed Bjorn that his map was an old version and that the Roman Empire had undergone significant changes, suggesting a visit to Sicily instead. The ruler of Sicily was Euphemius, a former Byzantine commander who had attempted to overthrow the Roman authority and fled to Sicily after his failure. Although Euphemius was a fugitive, he still possessed considerable power, so they decided to disguise themselves as merchants to enter the city without causing any disputes. They soon met Euphemius. However, upon hearing Bjorn was a merchant, Euphemius immediately drew his weapon, but Bjorn quickly subdued him. Euphemius then burst into laughter, revealing he was testing the Vikings' abilities since he needed guards rather than merchants. Given the many who sought to capture him, impressed by Bjorn's prowess, Euphemius offered to hire him as his bodyguard for a hefty sum. Without hesitation, Bjorn accepted. As his goal was adventure, Euphemius then embraced Bjorn, and the matter was settled simply as that. At the banquet, there was a woman named Kasia, a Christian nun taken from Byzantium by Euphemius. Kasia was famous in Byzantium, and the emperor had sentenced Euphemius to death for kidnapping. It seemed Euphemius was not exactly a noble character. The next day, Sinrik revealed that the real ruler was not Euphemius but an Arab chief named Ziyadat. Ziyadat controlled several cities in the Mediterranean, making Euphemius just one of his many agents, and Euphemius had to pay tribute to Ziyadat annually. After hearing Sinrik's explanation, Bjorn became interested in this chief. and they requested Euphemius to take them to see Zeodat. Originally Euphemius was reluctant, but under the threat of Cassia Euphemius decided to take them to meet Chief Zeodat. A nun with such a deterrent power made Bjorn realize Cassia was no ordinary woman. Soon, they arrived in Tunis, and after traveling through the Sahara Desert for a day and a night, they finally met Zeodat. Zeodat showed great hospitality. He had heard of Bjorn's experiences and he had dealt with Vikings from Kypros on many occasions, so Zeodat spoke Viking as well. Zeodat treated Bjorn and Halfdan generously, arranging for them to be entertained by exotic beauties. That night was busy for everyone. It turned out Cassia and Zeodat were old lovers, which explained her influence. Bjorn also forgot his duty as an escort and spent the night flirting with a beautiful woman. Interestingly, Halfdan found out that his companion was actually a man upon touching. The next day, unrest broke out outside, with Zeodat executing Euphemius's men, giving Bjorn a bad feeling. Indeed, Euphemius's body had been taken to the kitchen, where chefs debated which part of him would be tastier. Zeodat killed Euphemius because he found out that Euphemius was planning to betray him, and because Cassia had said a lot of bad things about Euphemius. Zeodat then casually hosted a banquet for Bjorn to celebrate their trade relations. Nordic furs, birds of prey, weapons, and slaves were highly popular in many regions. Discovering the delicious food was Euphemius. Bjorn and his companions lost their appetite, and their situation as Euphemius's nominal guards became perilous. Sure enough, influenced by something Cassia said, Zeodat decided to arrest and execute Bjorn and his party on the spot. Sinrik spotted an impending sandstorm, suggesting they could escape in the chaos if they delayed their execution until the storm hit. Others noticed the sandstorm too, so Cassia wanted to execute them quickly before it arrived. Thanks to the storm, Bjorn and his party survived their African adventure. However, during their journey, they witnessed vast deserts, experienced male prostitutes, and even consumed human flesh. These strange and extraordinary events will surely add vivid and dramatic strokes to their tales of adventure. Outside the city of York, Ethelwulf and Haemund shared their perspectives. Ethelwulf, who had lost many battles, thought they should retreat to Wessex and regroup. However, Haemund claimed he had seen victory, with God showing him visions of the enemy's corpses strewn across the land, engulfed in flames. Haemund's strategy was to besiege without attacking, blocking all passages to ensure the enemy could not access food. Once the enemy was completely cut off from supplies, York would inevitably fall without a fight. Following this, the English forces ambushed the Vikings' hunting parties daily, indicating the Vikings inside the city were indeed suffering from starvation. Fitzurk inquired about how to deal with the impending famine crisis. Ivar, however, appeared impatient.
Day we just grow weaker.
What are you really saying? Huh, brother? That I was wrong not to negotiate with the Saxons and that Duper was right.
Uber was wrong. That's why I didn't sail with him.
But now you regret it?
I just told you no. I am no one's dog. Ivar.
Facing his brother's heartfelt concerns, Ivar responded in such a manner. Meanwhile, Judith's cousin Mammal had arrived from Mercia to support their efforts to eliminate these pagans and avenge King El. A few days later, plumes of green smoke began emerging from within York. Haemund believed this to be God's work, thinking the enemy had started to burn their dead due to starvation. Given these signs, Ethelwulf planned to launch an immediate full-scale attack. Yet, Haemund once again directly opposed Ethelwulf's plan, suggesting they wait for his vision to fully materialize before attacking.
Oh, we can't always be guided by your visions, Bishop Hagen.
But surely you see the signs for yourself.
Oh, I also see other signs. How you put yourself forward, above me, to take command. Even though I am your king! I'm not God!
Forgive me, sire. King of Kings. I am your humble servant.
Ethelwulf finally erupted in anger, but he still heeded Haemund's counsel, unaware this would be Haemund's last advice to him. Days later, English scouts reported that the Vikings had abandoned the city. their siege strategy seemingly successful. After confirming that the city was empty, they picked up the fleeing townspeople. But what was puzzling was the sudden appearance of many rats on the ground. It turned out the Vikings had not retreated at all. Ivar had led his army to hide in the sewers, and the smoke was a deliberate ploy. Realizing the enemy was besieging them to starve them out, Ivar devised a counterplan to make them believe they were burning bodies, leaving an empty city for the enemy. Watching the unsuspecting English on the ground, Fitzurk finally understood the plan. As manhole covers opened, a flood of Vikings emerged from underground, stunning the celebrating English. They could never have imagined an enemy hiding in the sewers, and many soldiers lost their lives before they could react. The streets were thrown into chaos. Ivar's equipment had been upgraded. Now, he could fight upright and had acquired a set of long-range weapons. At this moment, the English forces were thrown into disarray again. As the main fighting force of England, Haemund was on horseback, cutting down the enemy. A furious Ethelwulf, blinded by rage, picked up stones and furiously smashed the enemy's heads. On another front, the physically frail Alfred faced his first real test as a warrior, confronting a berserk warrior wielding a giant hammer. Fortunately, Manel arrived in time, and together, they managed to take down the frenzied warrior. Learning from his previous experience, Ivar did not go into battle himself. Instead, he was accompanied by 2 bodyguards.
Spurs!
As the saying goes, shoot the horse to get the rider. Haemund was thrown heavily to the ground, crushed under his horse and spitting blood.
Hættu að bæjast! Gefðu hornum hestin minn! Smyggðu til kappjóð, hann skulle svara som góðskan kann Marjar bæjast!
It seemed Ivar truly admired Haemund. Instead of seizing the chance to kill him, Ivar gave Haemund an opportunity to turn the tables. Faced with such an unfavorable situation, Manel urged Ethelwulf to retreat quickly, but Ethelwulf, too ashamed to retreat again, preferred to die at York. Then, under Manel's cover, Ethelwulf retreated once again, marking his 3rd defeat. It's evident that Manel was a formidable fighter. After killing 3 men in succession, he was able to exchange blows with Fitzurk. However, in the end, he was struck in the back of the head by a Viking warrior wielding a giant hammer. Although Ivar gave Haemund a chance, the outnumbered warrior was still captured. Ivar did not kill Haemund, hoping to persuade this great warrior to join them. A few days later, the English finally abandoned their camp and retreated. Ivar considered whether to pursue them in victory. However, Fitzurk suggested they first take back Kattegat, given their lack of a stronghold and Bjorn's absence from Lagertha's side, making it the perfect opportunity to attack Kattegat. Ivar agreed with Fitzurk's viewpoint this time but wanted to find an ally first. Who Ivar is seeking as an ally will be revealed in the next episode. A woman seeks a fisherman's help to deliver a message, but he demands a favor in return.
You? I want you.
Indeed. After a long internal struggle, Astrid finally agrees to marry Harold. After all, Harold has been good to her, and she feels she has no other choice. But Astrid is also aware that marrying Harold means becoming enemies with Lagertha.
Luck has finally changed.
Upon returning to Kattegat, Ub has formed an alliance with Lagertha. Ub is preparing for war against Ivar, who not only killed Sigurd but also turned the brothers against each other. Meanwhile, Lagertha must deal with Harold, who is not only a potential threat but has also kidnapped her beloved Astrid.
Floki.
Before long, Floki returns to Kattegat, sharing his experiences in Iceland. He hopes to take some people back to Iceland to settle the land, but Lagertha, in need of warriors, does not allow Floki to take her soldiers. Still, Floki secretly gathers 2 families, promising them a better world. On the day of departure, Lagertha receives news and immediately sets out with her soldiers to stop them.
Kattegat is in danger and you've thought only of yourself. I've been betrayed very often in my life, but I've never got used to it. But I will allow you to go.
However, soft-hearted for their decades of friendship, Lagertha lets them go. After being captured, Hemund is brainwashed daily by Ivar, much like Ragnar did with Athelstan. Ivar wants Hemund to pledge loyalty to him, but Hemund, a bishop, holds unwavering faith in God. He despises these pagans and believes they deserve death.
But I could show you the ways of God. I could bring you to salvation and to eternal life.
See, this is the strength of Christianity. They welcome anyone, even a devil like Ivar. After leaving some of his men behind in York, Ivar arrived in Harold's territory with his army, and of course he took Hemund with him. Ivar invites Harold to attack Kattegat together, promising to bequeath the throne to Harold upon his own death. Given his disability and presumably short remaining lifespan, Harold and Ivar's thoughts align perfectly. Thus, the two strongest Vikings of the 9th century form an alliance. Later, Ivar wants Hemund to fight for him. In Hemund's eyes, attacking Kattegat means killing pagans, which doesn't contradict God's teachings. Hearing he can kill pagans, Hemund is indeed tempted, but he still wants to know why Ivar values him so much.
Because I am jealous of you. I would like to be like you. Strong. That is why I saved you.
At the feast on the night of the full moon, the men discuss the exact time of the attack on Kattegat. Harold says gathering the troops will take about a month, so they set the attack for 2 months later, on the night of the full moon.
It will be strange for you to return to Kattegat as a queen.
Astrid needs to notify Lagertha of this, so she bribes a fisherman with a large sum of money, but Hakon makes an excessive demand. For Lagertha's safety, Astrid is willing to make the sacrifice, but after the deed, Hakon invites several friends who also want to get close to the queen. Astrid, of course, refuses such an outrageous request.
If you don't submit, I'll tell King Harold how you plan to betray him.
But Hakon was a man of honor, and he passed on Harold's plan of attack to Lagertha. Thus, the war becomes a tragic fratricide, tarnishing Ragnar's legendary reputation. But now, they must accept reality and prepare their defenses within 2 months. Meanwhile, Hemund faces his ultimate choice if he doesn't help Ivar. He has no reason to live. Hemund asks for a dagger, seemingly to end his life and meet God, but instead, he kills the provocateur. This means Hemund chooses to help Ivar.
I think you will fight with us!
The Sami have a peculiar custom. They perform a partial castration on reindeer. The method doesn't involve removing the testicles from the sack, but rather, a man holds down the reindeer while a woman bites the testicles to crush them. After his travels, Bjorn returns to Kattegat to fight against their enemies. Lagertha calls upon many allies, including the Sami people. The Sami, also known as the Lapps, are the indigenous people of Scandinavia, known for their reindeer herding. Bjorn is immediately taken with Princess Snefrid, while others exchange brief ceremonial kisses. Bjorn lingers long, unwilling to part, leaving Torvi feeling extremely embarrassed by the side. After casual conversation, they start discussing the impending invasion. This is no ordinary battle. The attackers are Ivar, Hvitserk, and Harold, while the defenders include Bjorn, Ub, and Halfdan, making it a true case of fratricide. Halfdan sides with Bjorn because he is grateful to Bjorn for showing him a different world, making him feel as though he had wasted the previous decades of his life. Moreover, Bjorn saved his life in a sandstorm, so Halfdan pledges eternal loyalty to Bjorn, even if it means fighting against his own brother, Harold.
You and I crawled out from under the same rock. I believe you will fight against your brother.
Before the great battle, Bjorn plans to propose to Snefrid, as his marriage to Torvi has long been in name only. So, Lagertha approaches the Sami king to ask for his daughter's hand. Princess Snefrid appears gentle and demure but is wildly passionate inside. She directly takes Bjorn to a room and ties him up with a bola.
Instead, the men hold the reindeer down. We women chew the balls to pieces inside the sack. I told my father I was going to marry you the moment I saw you.
Inside the room, they were in the throes of passion, while Torvi, alone, was grieving outside. The scene is witnessed by a passing Ub, who has always admired Torvi, but both have their own marriages. Still, Ub offers words of comfort and shares a passionate kiss with Torvi before leaving, all of which Margreta witnesses clearly. Margreta is more concerned with overthrowing Lagertha, believing disaster is imminent and sees no point in risking her life for Lagertha anymore. From Harold's escape to Floki taking some of the people, Lagertha is at a disadvantage both in terms of intellect and authority. Margreta would rather have Ub join Ivar in defeating Lagertha. If Bjorn were to die, Ub, as the eldest son, could inherit the throne, making her the queen. This is not the first time Margreta has harbored such ambitions. Ub did not expect Margreta, who came from a slave background, to harbor such ambition. However, he did not respond to her proposal in any way. Then, the group starts discussing defense tactics. Bjorn suggests moving the battlefield to the plains outside the city to avoid damaging the town and to leverage the Sami's advantage in the forests. Based on his understanding of Ivar, to prevent enemy sneak attacks on his ships, Ivar would leave men behind for defense. This would reduce the number of troops Ivar has available on the main battlefield. But knowing Ivar's knack for anticipating enemy plans, Ub thinks what Bjorn considers. Ivar has already anticipated. If Ivar instead attacks from the sea, Kattegat would be defenseless, essentially handing their homeland over to the enemy. After much deliberation, Lagertha chose to trust Bjorn's judgment and use Ivar's intelligence to play a psychological war with him. Elsewhere, the repeatedly defeated Hvitserk returns to Wessex, where Egbert was still alive when they last departed. As they pray for the former king, Alfred collapses. A few days later Alfred recovered and traveled alone to Lindisfarne Abbey, the place where Athelstan had practiced and the first stop on the Vikings' invasion. Alfred seeks to understand his biological father and why the Vikings chose that location. He then suggests to the abbot that they should preach in English. Given that Christianity was introduced to England from Rome, Latin was initially the language of the church. Latin might feel grand, but its drawback is that most people don't understand it, complicating the spread of Christianity. Switching to English would allow more people to appreciate the greatness of God. Alfred's suggestion is quite remarkable. It accelerates the spread of Christianity and lays a good foundation for the Vikings' integration later. However, this is only Alfred's first proposal. Will the church heed his advice? This is a war of internal strife, where family members and lovers stand on opposite sides, and most of them are relatives of the legendary Viking leader, Ragnar.
It is not right that the sons of Ragnar should try and slaughter each other.
At Lagertha's suggestion, both sides hold a negotiation, with Bjorn and Ub pleading with Ivar to cease hostilities. Yet, the decision ultimately rests with Ivar. It was thought that Ivar was moved by his brother's words. They even raised their cups for a truce, but unexpectedly, Ivar suddenly changed his mind. Even valuing brotherhood, Ivar could not forgive the murder of his mother. If they wished to avoid fratricide, then Ivar's condition was for Lagertha to leave Kattegat, in exchange for peace. Clearly, Ivar's proposal was impossible, and the negotiation quickly escalated back to a state of conflict. But Lagertha didn't want to start a fight in this form. It would be too discreditable. So both sides went back to their camps and prepared for battle. Soon after, the armies faced off once again. Ivar always felt Bjorn was scheming. Perhaps all of this was a trap they had set from the beginning. So, Ivar decided to take a third of his men back to guard the ships to avoid a complete rout should something unexpected happen. He left Harold in charge of the main battlefield and Hvitserk to flank from the side. Since Astrid was pregnant, Harold had her and Ivar retreat for defense. Then, the battle officially began. Perhaps due to the limited space, not all warriors were deployed at once. Ivar, retreating, was also torn. If his judgment was wrong, then Harold, with insufficient forces, would be at a disadvantage. Hvitserk's troops encountered an ambush in the woods. The Sami, skilled in camouflage, engage in long-range attacks from within the forest, utilizing their weapons of choice, the concealed and deadly blow darts. Poison needles shot out of tiny bamboo tubes, killing the warriors before they could see their enemy. With no option but to retreat due to the ambush, Hvitserk's flanking attempt failed. As the second wave of warriors rushed to the battlefield, Harold still waited in the rear. At this point, both sides are evenly matched. The one who enjoyed the battle the most was Hemund. who killed countless pagans with his sacred sword. When Harold joined the fight, the remaining warriors also charged into battle, meaning Harold had played his last card, but Bjorn had yet to join the fray, indicating Harold's forces were at a disadvantage.
Still no regrets, brother! What is that to regret? You haven't won yet!
The reason Lagertha was not seen is because her role was similar to Vitzerk's. So, when Harold saw Lagertha flanking from behind, he started to panic. Seeing his mother join and Bjorn also join the battle with his remaining warriors, it was clear that they had 2 more sets of troops than the enemy. Due to the significant difference in troop numbers, Harold was quickly overwhelmed, prompting him to order the blowing of the horn to call for Ivar's.
They need us. They need us!
But Ivar was too far away, and it was too late for support, so he chose to minimize losses and did not reinforce. Haemon was captivated by Lagertha's gallant figure, and in the moment of his distraction, the enemy attacked him from behind. Seeing no support from Ivar, Harold had no choice but to order a retreat. This battle was fought by Harold from start to finish, with Ivar and Hvitser contributing nothing at all. Moreover, they took away nearly 40% of the forces, making Harold's loss extremely frustrating.
Where's Haemon? Your Christian's dead. Come.
So, did Haemon really die? And how will Ivar respond after this defeat? I'll see you in the next episode. Have you ever seen a man's face swell up like a pig's head after being stung by a bee? During the time Ivar was fighting in the Civil War, something significant happened in Wessex as well. King Ethelwulf was reading a book when he was accidentally stung by a bee, and not long after, his face swelled up like a pig's head. It makes one wonder, can a single bee really be that venomous? Who would have thought that the noble Lord Ethelwulf would meet his end at the hands of a bee? However, amidst the sorrow, selecting a new king was of utmost importance. Judith was aware that the council would definitely choose Ethelred as the new king. As the eldest son, not only did Ethelred have the right of succession, but he was also the one whom Ethelwulf had focused on grooming. Yet, Judith requested Ethelred to cede the throne to his younger brother Alfred. Because Ethelwulf was a warrior king, he could only train another warrior by his standards. England at the time needed a ruler who could control the overall situation. Much like Egbert, Egbert had taught Alfred through words and deeds, from which Alfred learned many methods of governance. Moreover, Alfred had been sent to meet the Pope in Rome as a child, where he was crowned in the capacity of a successor to the throne. Due to Haemon's disappearance, Judith offered the position of Bishop of Sherborne, which was below Haemon in prestige, to another bishop, Cuthred, in exchange for his support for Alfred. Despite great reluctance, Ethelred eventually followed his mother's arrangement. Naturally, the succession fell to the younger son when the elder one relinquished the throne. However, the council refused to accept a sickly king, showing more support for Ethelred's succession. To quell the voices of opposition, Ethelred once again emphasized his support for his brother Alfred to inherit the throne. Coupled with Cuthred's stance, the council finally compromised. In fact, this plot deviates somewhat from history. Historically, Ethelred was king for 5 years. In his final year, Ethelred was severely injured in a battle against the Vikings and only passed the throne to Alfred on his deathbed. While clearing the battlefield, Lagertha discovered Haemon and knew this man was no ordinary warrior upon seeing his unusual sword. Fortunately, Haemon was not dead, so Lagertha decided to take him back to camp for treatment. It wasn't long before Haemon woke up. Perhaps it was mutual attraction, so their first meeting did not feel strange, and they even discussed topics related to their respective beliefs. For the first time, Haemon openly admitted that he didn't have God's holy love and that he craved physical love. Lagertha's faith was not so complicated. The gods encouraged them to enjoy all pleasurable things.
Then you have no guilt.
No.
I envy you.
As England's most valiant warrior, Hemond hasn't had the best of times lately. He had been humiliated by Ivar after being captured, and now he was Lagertha's prisoner of war, and the soldiers made fun of Hemond every day. However, unlike Hemond's attitude towards Ivar, he started showing favor to Lagertha from the beginning.
What are you doing?
I wanted to talk to you.
Inside Lagertha's tent, Hemond began to display his charm. Hemond said their coming together was arranged by fate, openly expressing his liking for Lagertha, and even stated he was willing to fight and die for her.
Even though you don't know me.
I've known you my whole life.
After the defeat, Ivar returned to Harald's domain. Ivar finally tasted defeat. To be precise, he was defeated by his own caution. Harald believed Ivar should be responsible for this failure, while Ivar maintained that victory and defeat were common in war. While exploring the Mediterranean together, Rollo promises to give Hvitserk any help he needs, so they decide to send Hvitserk to Normandy to get help. A few days later, Rollo indeed sent dozens of warships to support them, with a rough estimate of over 1,000 French soldiers joining Ivar's camp. Kattegat also received this news, wondering why Rollo would get involved. With the participation of the French, Kattegat was inevitably lost. Thus, Bjorn once again went to the enemy camp for negotiations, hoping to persuade Rollo not to participate in the war. However, Rollo simply handed over the troops to Hvitserk's command and did not appear in person. Despite Bjorn's pleas, Ivar insisted on attacking Kattegat, vowing not to rest until he avenged his mother's death.
I'm sorry Rollo had to involve himself in our quarrel.
Doesn't he have worlds enough to conquer?
This was the Second Battle of the Civil War, also known as Ivar's War of Revenge, and the outcome would directly determine the fate of Kattegat. To better hide in the forests, the Sami people used extensive green to camouflage themselves. Before parting, Bjorn reluctantly said goodbye to Snefrid, but who could have predicted that this farewell would turn into a permanent goodbye? Snefrid, wild at heart, showed no mercy in battle either. Her combination of slingshots and daggers allowed her to effortlessly take down several enemies. But war is cruel, and it wasn't long before Snefrid discovered her father's body. After a brief moment of sorrow, Snefrid threw herself back into the fray, only to be tragically struck in the neck by a fast-following enemy after she had killed another. After each killing several enemies, Ob and Hvitserk finally met. Ob, with sword in hand, swung at Hvitserk, who had abandoned him for Ivar and now had even sought foreign French support to attack his own kin. Knowing he had wronged Ob, Hvitserk did not dodge or flee, allowing his brother to decide his fate. But even in his rage, Ob found he could not bring himself to harm his brother. However, the story was different for another pair of brothers. After killing several enemies, Halfdan encountered Harald.
I didn't want to kill you, brother!
As soon as Harald said he didn't want to kill Halfdan, he raised his sword and cut Halfdan's carotid artery. But Halfdan had no intention of evading. Dying by his brother's hand was meaningful to him since he owed Bjorn his life and had to stand against his brother. Yet, not wanting to harm his brother, Halfdan chose this way to end his life.
I will see you in Valhalla. See you in Valhalla.
The third to fall was Torvi's eldest son, Guthrum, son of Jarl Borg. Despite growing up with Hvitserk, Hvitserk did not hesitate. The fourth was Astrid. Lagertha did not want to harm her, but Astrid was bent on seeking death. Astrid did not want to fight Lagertha but could not betray her husband either. Moreover, the child in her womb was conceived from rape by Håkon, so every mention of the child reminded Astrid of her humiliation. With no other choice, Astrid swung her sword at Lagertha, who reflexively struck back, ending Astrid's tragic life. By this point in the battle, Ivar, with his numerical advantage, was virtually assured victory, his adrenaline so high that he even discarded his crutch. The primary reason Ivar initiated this civil war was to avenge his mother's death. Had Lagertha not fired that arrow, perhaps none of this would have happened. Ivar also spotted Hemund, whom he greatly admired, although Hemund had now turned from ally to enemy, but none of that mattered now. To Ivar, everyone else was like soulless skeleton soldiers. He sought only Lagertha's life. At any cost, Bjorn ordered his archers to fire at Ivar's position. Ivar confidently faced the barrage of arrows, and miraculously, the arrows once again missed him. Bjorn was left stunned by the sight. It seemed the gods were indeed on Ivar's side, and at his command, the French soldiers began to enter the fray, mopping up what remained. Seeing the fields overrun by the blue-clad army, Bjorn knew the situation was lost, so he ordered a retreat, signifying their loss of Kattegat. They had to pack up and leave immediately, for Ivar would soon lead his forces to take everything that belonged to them. The most heart-wrenching sight was Lagertha, curled up in a corner with a vacant stare, her hair turning white in an instant. She had lost not only her kingdom but had also killed her lover, leaving one to wonder when she might find the strength to rise again. Meanwhile, Rollo was about to arrive at Kattegat, raising questions about the intentions behind his involvement and what he hoped to gain from it.
I am Ivar the Boneless! I am a son of Ragnar Lothbrok! All hail your new king!
Although Ivar managed to take Kattegat, he wasn't happy because he didn't get to avenge his mother's murder as he had hoped. But Harold was even more despondent, having killed his brother by his own hand and lost his wife and unborn child. Even conquering the world couldn't fill the void he felt inside. Soon after, Rollo arrived at Kattegat, his support stemming from a belief in Ivar's victory and a desire to seize the opportunity to sign trade agreements and mutual aid pacts. Given Kattegat's status as Norway's largest trading port, as for the whereabouts of Bjorn and the others, despite deploying a large search party, their location remained elusive. It turns out, they had escaped to an abandoned farmstead. This was the same refuge used by Ragnar's family when Borg took Kattegat. A time before Ivar was born, Lagertha refused to accept this outcome, but with their current strength, there was no way to stand against Ivar. Hemund suggested seeking refuge in England, on the condition they pledge loyalty to King Ethelwulf. Clearly unaware of Ethelwulf's passing, Hemund believed his relationship with Ethelwulf could guarantee safety for Lagertha and her company in England, but if he resumes his role as bishop, his relationship with Lagertha must be hidden, and even then he cannot live without Lagertha.
Even though it goes against my teachings, my faith, my church, my being in Christ, I cannot renounce you. You are an incredible woman, Lagertha. Your God must have meant for us to meet.
Hemund's words deeply moved Lagertha. It seems England was their next destination. Meanwhile, Rollo had stealthily left Kattegat and made his way to the farmstead, a place where he, too, had once resided. Rollo was straightforward in his proposal to bring Lagertha and her son back to Francia, promising their safety. Lagertha was puzzled. Rollo was helping Ivar against them, yet he also promised to protect them. Rollo's intentions were clear. He hoped to force Lagertha into a corner with Ivar's help, then play the hero by taking them in. Rollo had always loved Lagertha, even claiming Bjorn was his son. Lagertha couldn't refute this claim, given her history with Rollo, but Bjorn disagreed.
You may be my father, but then again you may not. At the time of my conception, you may have been laying with my mother, but then again so was Ragnar. So who do I look most like? Who do I resemble most? In spirit and principle. Ah, now that is of most importance. And for that, undoubtedly, Ragnar.
The notion that Rollo was Bjorn's father might have been wishful thinking on Rollo's part. After all, sleeping with Lagertha didn't make him Bjorn's father, especially since Bjorn was historically much older than Rollo. Even with Rollo's promise of wealth and honor, Bjorn remained unmoved, tired of Rollo's duplicity.
He betrayed us. He betrayed my father. You nearly died because of him, Lagertha. Because of his treachery. And then, he betrays us A second time with Ivar.
Though they rejected Rollo's offer, he still ended up helping them. Rollo informed Ivar of Lagertha's location, but she had already left, leaving Ivar to lead a large force to capture nothing. Lagertha and her group took this opportunity to return to Kattegat and steal a warship. Thus, they officially left their homeland, embarking on their journey to England. Back in Wessex, to fend off Norse invasions, Alfred planned to build defensive structures along the coast and riverbanks and to strengthen the navy for better maritime combat capability. He also proposed the church's adoption of English, sparking outrage in the council. The newly appointed Bishop Cuthard stated outright that this was a matter for the church and that not even the king had the authority to interfere. This meant that Alfred, already lacking support, faced further opposition from the church. In the minds of the nobles, Ethelred was still the best choice for king, as his achievements and abilities were obvious to all. Soon, Lagertha and her group reached Wessex via the River Elne, but the soldiers on the shore saw the Viking ship and immediately shot arrows from their bows. But Ethelred recognized Hemund in time, otherwise they would have ended up like the pirates.
We will it haben, je moet. We do the father. Koning Ethelwolf.
Mein father! He's dead!
Still, Lagertha and her company were taken as prisoners and locked up, leaving their fate uncertain. Will the new king take Hemund's advice? We'll find out in the next episode.
I shouldn't be here.
Why not?
God will punish me.
Lagertha and his party were jailed just after they arrived in Wessex, so they thought Hemund was a fraud. Now, not only had they safely delivered Hemund home, but they had also landed themselves in jeopardy. However, Lagertha did not believe that Hemund would deceive her.
And I cannot believe the famous Lagertha has proved to be a fool for love.
The next day, Alfred summoned them. In exchange for their safety and freedom, they were required to help fight against the Vikings invading England. Bjorn wants East Anglia back first, but before he can finish speaking, Lagertha agrees to Alfred's terms. Thus began a true collaboration between the Vikings and the Saxons, a partnership that owed its existence to Hemund's efforts. Seizing the opportunity, Hemund sought to reclaim his bishopric. Upon discovering that his position had been filled, Hemund flew into a rage. However, Alfred informed Hemund that the new bishop did not get along with him, and his position was not secure enough to restore Hemund to his bishopric, even if he wanted to. Moreover, Hemund's association with the pagans had significantly altered his image among the people. Therefore, Hemund needed to prove his loyalty to the king and to God before he could be reinstated as bishop. But Hemund lacked patience. Without his title, he couldn't protect Lagertha, leading him to confront Cuthard at the Sherborne church.
Is my place. I am Sherborne's true bishop, not you. You are a hypocrite and should step aside before the Lord finds you out.
But who would easily give up such hard-won power? Cuthard knew that Hemund was not a clean man, so he kept his men watching Hemund's every move. Before long, Cuthard caught Hemund and Lagertha in a secret rendezvous, not just once but multiple times. Meanwhile, when Ub revealed the land deed, they realized it was all a deception. The old king's promises regarding East Anglia were meaningless, as he had already passed the crown to Ethelwolf. But dwelling on the past was futile at this point. Alfred now had the authority to grant lands, though this would face public opposition from the council and nobles, given that these were lands once invaded and their kin killed by pagans. Therefore, they had to first prove their worth. Later, Alfred sought to persuade Ub alone, hoping he could convince everyone to convert to Christianity. This would significantly reduce the opposition when he granted them lands.
I can't imagine Bjorn would ever agree to that.
I'm not talking about Bjorn, but about you.
At a banquet, Alfred's fiancée, Elswith, made her first appearance, showing particular curiosity towards the imposing Norsemen.
Here at your court.
The sons of King Ragnar Lothbrok, the most famous of all Northmen, on our side and prepared to fight for us.
Given Alfred's busy schedule, he rarely had time to foster a romantic relationship with Elswith, but Elswith seemed indifferent to this, as the Norsemen were more than enough to keep her entertained. Bjorn also noticed Elswith's gaze, but did you think that was the end? Elswith barged into Bjorn's room at night. Despite her protests that it wasn't right, she slid under Bjorn's covers.
I'm a virgin.
Thus, Elswith gave her virginity to Bjorn, and if things go as they usually do, she might even bear Bjorn a child. Poor Alfred was cuckolded before he even got married. Who made him pull of strings and make them betray the gods? Later, Hemund received a letter from Cuthard, essentially stating that he had evidence of Hemund's adultery with Lagertha and intended to make it public, aiming to disgrace Hemund. Apparently Cuthard messed with the wrong person to save his position.
You have forced me to it, Lord Cuthard. You have forced me. Or a most troublesome priest. A hollow man.
There's a hell!
Egwin, this is how the world will end.
No, just your world.
In the most sacred of churches, before their all-powerful god, Hemund killed Cuthard. Although Hemund helped Alfred directly with Cuthard, it's also true that he broke the law. So will he be punished by the council? And can Alfred provide support for Hemund? We shall see.
By your blood, I will bear you a child, a son, and he too will be a god, like you.
After seizing Kattegat, Ivar once again encountered Freydis. Ever since Freydis had offered herself to him, Ivar had been unable to forget her. She was one of the few people who could make Ivar show a gentler side. Freydis continued to worship Ivar as a hero, just as before, proclaiming that he was chosen by the gods. This completely disarmed Ivar, leading him to share many of his innermost thoughts with her. It was clear that Ivar had decided on this woman, and it wasn't long before Freydis was crowned queen. From a slave to a queen, a crow turned phoenix, a dream Margrethe had always harbored. Now, she was not only betrayed by Ub but also abandoned on the farm. Fortunately, Hvitserk, with his deep sense of loyalty, took in the disgraced Margrethe. Yet, she remained her usual self, spreading rumors that Ivar was impotent and even inciting Hvitserk to kill Ivar and claim the throne for himself. When Freydis became intimate with Ivar, she too discovered his issue. However, her approach was far more sophisticated than Margrethe's had ever been.
You know I can't.
Ivar, listen to me. To me you are a god, and I will have your child. By your blood, I will bear you a child, a son, and he too will be a god, like you.
What Freydis means is that Ivar is a god, so she can conceive Ivar's child in another way, by drinking Ivar's blood. But it wasn't long before Freydis found another man and engaged in a passionate encounter in the stable. Clearly, Freydis' previous assurances were just to appease Ivar, and to deceive him. She had to become pregnant. Soon, Freydis told Ivar she was pregnant. Although skeptical, Ivar was moved to tears of joy.
What?
With your child, Ivar.
Perhaps due to the stress of recent events, Ivar began to blur the lines between reality and dreams, envisioning Margrethe disguised as the queen, stabbing him in the heart with a dagger, since his mother had a knack for foreseeing the future through dreams. This recurring nightmare greatly unsettled Ivar. He asked Hvitserk what should be done about Margrethe. Of course, Hvitserk would not harm Margrethe and told Ivar to stay out of it, but Ivar would not heed this advice. One night, 3 assassins crept into Margrethe's cabin. Margrethe was struck in the back by a thrown knife just as she attempted to flee, realizing too late that her madness had brought her doom.
I love Ivar. It's not worth killing me. I'm harmless. I'm mad about regret.
Such ruthless actions by Ivar drove a deeper wedge between him and Hvitserk. Before long, the idle Harold decided to return to England, as battle was their creed. Since Ivar had left a large garrison in York, that was Harold's first stop. Throughout, Hvitserk wore a gloomy expression, finally exploding in anger when Ivar questioned him.
I'm your little brother, and you know exactly what's wrong with me. Margaret is dead. I know.
Of course you know! You ordered the killing!
Why would I do that?
Because she knew that
But you could never get a woman pregnant.
Ivar seized this moment to dispel the rumors of his infertility, announcing to everyone that the queen was pregnant. Ivar couldn't understand why Hvitserk cared so much for a madwoman when there were so many beautiful women in Kattegat, but Hvitserk genuinely loved Margreta. It must be said, Hvitserk's affection was unmatched by any of his brothers. He used this as an opportunity to vent all his frustrations towards Ivar, from Sigurd's death to Ub's departure and the subsequent civil wars. Ivar had finally alienated the last of his brothers. Perhaps Freydis was the only light left in Ivar's heart, but Freydis was not only more cunning than any previous queen, she also had very sophisticated methods. She found that man again, and he never expected the gentle beauty to turn into a cold noose. After days of travel, Floki and his group finally arrived in Iceland, but when they disembarked, they realized that it was not what Floki had described, and that the endless barren land around them was not even comparable to Kattegat. Two families had followed Floki on this journey, the Ivan family and the Kjetil family. Ivan was the first to question Floki, pointing out the impossibility of cultivation in a land of nothing but rocks. He felt deceived by Floki. Kjetil, however, trusted in Floki's character, arguing that complaints wouldn't solve their problems. Days later, without sighting the promised fertile lands, they discovered a large area of hot springs. Floki decided they would settle there. Iceland, known for its extensive landscape of 103,000 square kilometers, is a true island of ice and fire, with vast glaciers, dozens of active volcanoes, and hundreds of dormant ones. The aftermath of volcanic eruptions leaves barren land, with only about 3% of the terrain suitable for cultivation. Perhaps the area Floki had seen before was part of that 3%. Now, returning, their failure to find it was understandable. Ivan's son and Kjetil's daughter, who were a couple, planted the first seed of love in this new world within the hot springs. Up until then, everyone lived in peace. One day Floki wanted to build a temple to Thor. The Ivan family objected, arguing there were not enough resources and energy to construct a temple when their houses were still unfinished. Kjetil agreed with Floki, only to be accused by Ivan of pandering. Ivan lamented that they had been lured away from their queen and homeland for Floki's fantasy of kingship, only to end up in misery. He insisted that their priority should be to secure enough food to survive the winter, expressing negativity throughout the conversation. Despite this, the temple construction proceeded, though Ivan's family neither contributed resources nor helped. This led to verbal altercations between the younger members of the two families.
You don't sound like a bull. You sound like a dog. So that's what I'm going to call you. Bull the dog!
Eventually, the parents from both sides also became openly hostile. Vikings are known for resolving disputes through combat, but Kjetil's daughter Aud intervened in time to prevent bloodshed. Soon, the temple was completed. More of a simple altar than a temple, really. They conducted a sacrifice ceremony, praying to Thor for safety and a bountiful harvest. However, the Ivan family, who had contributed nothing to the labor, showed up for the blessings. Bull even stole the sacrificial offerings for his own family's use.
This is sacred. Thor is here. All right. Have it.
Such sacrilegious behavior finally angered Floki, who grabbed his axe, ready to strike, but Aud once again stopped him in time. Since Helga's death, Floki's desire for violence had lessened. In the past, he surely would have slain anyone disrespecting the gods. However, Floki's actions earned Ivan's resentment. In retaliation, they set fire to the newly built temple. The statue of Thor was also destroyed in the blaze. In Viking belief, the destruction of a god's statue foretold disaster. The moment Floki saw the temple collapse, he was utterly devastated. Kjetil's son Thorgrim accused Bull of arson, leading to another confrontation. In the scuffle, Bull drew a knife on Thorgrim, who in turn killed Bull in self-defense. This was the first bloodshed in Iceland. Unfortunately, this was just the beginning. Their venture in Iceland soon turned into a massive disaster, with Thor's wrath descending upon them all. In the end, Floki's mind was filled with nothing but endless regret. After finding out that Hemund had killed Cuthard, Alfred angrily accused Hemund.
And now, still drenched in the martyr's blood, you come and defile this holy place too. Surely to God you do not mean to try and defend yourself.
But Hemund came prepared. he had evidence of Cuthred's intention to rebel. Because Alfred attempted to interfere with church privileges and ally with pagans, they plotted to overthrow Alfred. Haemon believed that discovering and eliminating the opposition leaders in time should be credited as a merit, not a fault. Aside from Cuthred, many in the church and council were involved. So Alfred intended to return the bishopric to Haemon to continue investigating the traitors, since he was the only supporter Alfred had left. However, this idea angered Ethelred, who believed that Haemon must pay for his grave sins.
That is not your decision, brother. For I am king and I alone can make that determination.
Lagertha was very unsettled upon hearing the news of Haemon's imprisonment. Without their only protector, they were in great danger. Thus, Ob remembered the proposal to convert to Christianity. This infuriated Bjorn. Their father was waiting for them in Valhalla, and if they converted to Christianity, wouldn't they be unable to meet their father again?
Sometimes I wonder if you're regular for it all.
Later, Alfred announced 3 major decisions at a meeting. First, he decided to release Haemon and restore his bishopric, despite strong protests from the council and nobles. But Alfred still forcefully dismissed the opposition. In such a turbulent period, he couldn't abandon the nation's guardian. As England's greatest warrior, Haemon must shine on the battlefield, not die on the execution ground. Second, he announced his marriage to his fiancée, Elswith. Third, he announced Ub and Torvi's conversion to Christianity. Aside from the marriage, the other 2 announcements caused strong dissatisfaction among the council.
I ask all of you, in God's name, to recognize and celebrate this conversion.
And even Ethelred complained to his mother about Alfred's decisions. As for why Ethelred was constantly at odds with Alfred recently, one reason was because he was in love with Cuthred's daughter. He wanted to execute Haemon to avenge his girlfriend's father. The second reason was that he wanted to overthrow Alfred's rule and reclaim the throne for himself. Haemon is wrong about one thing. The leader of the opposition is not Cuthred but Ethelred. Although Judith didn't know this yet, she had already sensed Ethelred's thirst for the throne. Meanwhile, Harold had arrived in York and, after a brief rest, led his army towards Wessex. Accompanying Harold in battle were the Lord of York, Olafson, and his wife, Gunhild. Harold was immediately taken with the tall woman, even though she was already married. Upon learning of the Vikings' movements, the opposition quickly convened an underground meeting. They planned to use the opportunity to call a war council and launch a coup during the meeting to capture Alfred and Haemon, among others, and then support Ethelred's ascent to the throne.
I agree. Call the council.
Everything was proceeding according to plan. They not only replaced the guards with their own men but also smuggled weapons into the palace, ready to act at any moment. But at the critical moment, Ethelred couldn't overcome his psychological barrier. He couldn't bring himself to act against his own brother, with the leader hesitating to give the signal. The plan fell through.
I've decided to lead you into battle. But I know that I've the support of my beloved brother, Aethelred.
I can't. Then we are lost.
Later, Bjorn brought a man named Magnus, who claimed to be the son of Ragnar and Queen Quenthrith. Yes, he was the boy who was driven away after Ragnar's denial. Ub had heard from his mother about the rumor that his father denied sleeping with Quenthrith, and Lagertha also knew it was merely about urination, so they suspected this supposed son had ulterior motives. But Bjorn believed Magnus' story, knowing his father's penchant for dalliances. After all, Ragnar slept with a slog right in front of him.
I don't want to argue.
You don't believe me? I can see it.
So, could they accept Magnus? What really are his intentions? Do you know what hell really looks like? One day, Haemon had a nightmare where he found himself falling into hell, surrounded by demons and lost souls. Then he saw an egg about to hatch, but inside was a baby already covered in worms. God then appeared to Haemon as a deer and told him he must abandon his unclean deeds, or he would be tormented by the flames of hell forever, with the cries of sinners constantly echoing around him. Therefore, he must break up with Lagertha.
You can't do this. You can't do this to me. I thought you loved me.
Haemon did not deny or argue. As a devout Christian, he always took his dreams as divine guidance. Before departing, Alfred arrested an opposition member, all thanks to Judith. With the army gone, Judith was in charge of the interrogation. Her goal was clear: to extract the full list of opposition members through severe torture. On the eve of battle, Ub arrived at Harold's camp, hoping to exchange gold for peace as a Christian. Harold couldn't believe a son of Ragnar would betray the gods and believe in God. Still, Ub gave Harold a day to consider. Knowing the renown of Bjorn and Ub was more intimidating than any army. After Ub left, Magnus approached Harold, claiming to be Ragnar's son. He believed Ub and the others were beyond redemption and unworthy of being the sons of the Viking legend, Ragnar. As Ragnar's son, Magnus didn't want to fight for England, so he chose to join Harold's side. The next day, Ub did not show up with the gold, and Harold realized he had been deceived. The supposed peace talks were just a stalling tactic. The English must have secured advantageous terrain and prepared for battle. Sure enough, when Harold led his forces to the battlefield, the English had long been waiting, surprisingly choosing a scorched piece of land. As they wondered, Ub lit the pre-arranged straw. It turns out that they have made a semicircle with the straws on the charred ground, so that only the straws will burn when the fire is lit, and the flames will block the Vikings' retreat. Haemund's premonition was coming true. The battle was about to turn into a hell on earth.
To battle! For Christ! For Wessex! For England!
Olavsson was immediately killed by an arrow to the head, and Gunhild, as fierce as Lagertha, kept fighting valiantly even as some of her side fled.
Do you want you? The gods are watching!
Despite their recent breakup, Lagertha was still keeping an eye on her lover, and the traitorous Magnus truly had some skills. To live up to the identity of Ragnar's son, he must have undergone extensive combat training. Alfred, having changed his appearance, was no longer weak, thanks to Ub's training, but he was still overpowered and knocked down by the enemy, saved in the nick of time by Ethelred.
The king.
Haemund's affection for Lagertha remained unabated. He watched her with a smile like a happy child. Last time, Haemund was attacked because he was distracted, and this time, it cost him his life. His biggest regret at that moment must have been his decision to break up with Lagertha, and Lagertha was unfortunately struck in the leg by an enemy, and when she killed her attacker and looked back at Haemund, he had already been hit by several arrows and fell to his knees. Then Gunhild ended Haemund's life. Once again, Lagertha watched her lover die in front of her. Gunhild not only killed Haemund but also nearly made Bjorn lose an eye. Even Bjorn was taken aback by her strength, so he made sure to exert all his effort to subdue her. Yes, it was subduing, not killing. It seems Bjorn also took a liking to her. The English's bravery took Harold by surprise, and seeing his warriors heavily decimated, he knew the tide had turned. Though they won the battle, England lost a great warrior. Though Haemund was not a bishop who kept himself clean, he was always God's most faithful servant.
No one else will ever be fit to carry his sword, which will be buried with him.
With Haemund's death in battle, Lagertha disappeared, and everyone searched the entire battlefield without finding a trace of her.
I don't think we are going to find her.
Ever since Gunhild slashed him with her sword, Bjorn hasn't been able to stop thinking about her, because her tall stature fits the Viking aesthetic perfectly. Moreover, Bjorn recognizes Gunhild's extraordinary combat skills, but he doesn't want to force her into anything. After all, bullying prisoners of war isn't his style. So, Bjorn unbound Gunhild, but her reaction took him by surprise.
Oh! What was that for? I was just exercising my freedom.
Just like that, Bjorn easily won Gunhild's favor. To thank Ub and the others for helping him fend off a formidable enemy, Alfred fulfilled his promise. He truly gave them East Anglia, as Egbert had promised. This marked a historic event for the Vikings' formal integration into England, finally realizing Ragnar's dream.
And now I welcome you, formally, as allies and as friends.
The meeting then moved on to the next item.
Gods,
Arrest the traitors.
Alfred arrested all members of the opposition for treason, clearly having gotten that list from Judith. However, Alfred did not arrest Ethelred. After all, Ethelred had saved his life on the battlefield, but Judith believed the matter couldn't be let go so easily. At the very least, Ethelred had to explain himself and admit his wrongdoings in person, making him understand that he was spared by Alfred's mercy, not luck. But Alfred was unwilling to confront his own brother, so Judith had to deal with the matter herself. Afterwards, the opposition members were hanged in public, providing a strong deterrent to Ethelred. Faced with reality, Ethelred could only confess everything to his mother, sincerely admitting his mistake and swearing to protect Alfred with his life. Seeing Ethelred's sincerity finally put Judith's heart at ease. It wasn't long before Alfred brought them to East Anglia to avoid previous attacks. Alfred dispatched his own guards to protect the Viking settlers. Ob and Torvi were ready to embrace their new life, but Bjorn didn't want to stay and farm. Even though Lagertha was missing, he still wanted to take back Kattegat for his mother. In his conversation with Gunhild, Bjorn learned that Harald's next plan was also to attack Kattegat, so he bid farewell to Ob and Torvi and went to join Harald with Gunhild. Although Bjorn had defeated Harald on the battlefield, Harald bore no grudge against Bjorn. Not only did he welcome Bjorn's arrival, but he also agreed to take him to attack Kattegat together.
Has, after all, brought us back together again. Who knew what the gods had in store for us?
This highlighted the Vikings' tendency to band together. Unless there were deep-seated vendettas, they typically collaborated for mutual benefit. However, Harald was irked that the woman he fancied was now with someone else, especially Bjorn. On the other side, Alfred fell into a coma again, and no one knew what illness he had or could treat it. When the news of Alfred's unconscious state spread, the council and the church raised questions again, still reluctant to pledge allegiance to a sickly king. But Ethelred easily calmed everyone's emotions. It was clear that Ethelred still had high popularity in the council, but this was exactly what Judith feared. She worried that these people would support Ethelred to seize power while Alfred was in a coma. So, Judith wanted to know the content of their recent conversation.
I say to them what I have a mind to say, to heal my poor brother.
Though both were her sons, Judith always favored Alfred. She wouldn't allow anyone to covet Alfred's throne, not even her other son. Thus, Judith secretly poisoned Ethelred's wine and had dinner and chatted with him as if nothing was amiss. And Ethelred, just like usual, had dinner and chatted with his mother, but the poison acted quickly, not even allowing him to finish the meal.
What have you done?
That you have ever accepted your brother as king. You could always be a danger to him.
So you poisoned me. What kind of mother are you?
Judith poisoned one son for the sake of the other. Although this plot differs from history, it's still shocking to watch. Compared to Judith poisoning her own son and Quenthrith poisoning her brother, Ivar's fratricide seems almost trivial. If I had to pick a legendary scene from Season 5 of Vikings, it would undoubtedly be this bizarre assembly of a bird, a man, and a dwarf. As for why this man is wandering naked in a frozen, snowy landscape, let's reveal that mystery right now. Under Freydis' constant flattery, Ivar has become completely delusional, believing himself to actually be a god and even holding a ceremony to declare his divinity. He captures a woman and dresses her up as Lagertha, telling the people that she is Lagertha and that he will sacrifice her to avenge his mother's death. Despite knowing the woman is an imposter, the people remain silent out of fear of Ivar. However, a few brave souls dare to call out Ivar's deception and speak up for their queen in their hearts. Ivar took the opportunity to arrest them for their complicity with Lagertha. Even though the double begged, Ivar brutally sacrificed her in front of everyone. Hvitser can't stand Ivar's self-delusion anymore, mocking his pretense of divinity and publicly exposing his tricks. A defiant Ivar consults the seer, hoping to hear what he desires, but the seer not only tells Ivar that he is merely a mortal but also foresees Ivar's chariot breaking apart like his legs.
Has settled in your skull, and your eyes betray you. Your path is strewn with garbage and filth. Oh, the horror.
After saying this, the seer foretold his own death, which might have been the closest his predictions ever came to the actual outcome. Because of the seer's words, Ivar, enraged, kills the seer. The next day, they claim the seer has left Kattegat, but the observant Hvitserk notices blood on the ground. He knows only the brutal Ivar would dare harm the seer, though Ivar suggests it could have been a trap by the seer, though the incident is left unresolved. Divine retribution is often delayed but inevitable. It wasn't long before news of Lagertha and the others helping Alfred in defeating Harold reached Kattegat. Ivar decides it's time to play another game with Alfred, but for caution, he seeks allies.
Sorry to startle you.
He sends Hvitserk to forge an alliance with King Olaf and plans to start in spring. Hvitserk is reluctant, not wanting to be at Ivar's beck and call, especially since he has just started a relationship with a girl named Thora. But Ivar, indifferent, uses Thora's life as leverage over Hvitserk, with no choice. Given Ivar's madness, Hvitserk agrees. Upon Hvitserk's arrival at his destination, amidst a heavy snowfall, the steward Canute insists Hvitserk strip and follow him.
But first you must take off your clothes.
Thus, a scene with a naked man and a dwarf walking through a snowy landscape is born. King Olaf had long been aware of Hvitserk's visit and had been waiting once again. Meanwhile, someone destroys Ivar's statue, signaling his loss of the people's heart. Investigations reveal that Hvitserk's girlfriend, Thora, was involved in the act. Ivar is baffled, wondering why, despite his efforts to be a good king, people still oppose, criticize, and tarnish his image. Thora recalls her parents saying that in Ragnar's time, everyone was free to do as they pleased and speak their minds. No one forced them to worship Ragnar because Ragnar knew he was just a man, but Ivar forced the people to worship him every day. Moved yet reflective after hearing this, Ivar doesn't introspect but instead burns Thora and her family alive. Days later, Hvitserk finally voices his true thoughts, describing Ivar's cruelty to Olaf and asking for his help to overthrow Ivar's tyranny. But with Olaf already allied with Ivar, it's not easy for him to be swayed by just a few words from Hvitserk. So, Olaf hangs Hvitserk in a sauna, using the heat and dehydration to test his sincerity. Days pass, but Hvitserk remains steadfast in his conviction. His sincere attitude and strong will convincing Olaf. Thus, Olaf agrees to help Hvitserk rescue the people of Kattegat from tyranny.
Ivar's kingdom. Good.
When Alfred discovers that his mother poisoned his brother to protect him, he's utterly devastated. Unable to fathom that his mother could be so cruel, Judith tells Alfred to deal with state affairs once he's done venting. As a king, he can't afford the luxury of ordinary human emotions, nor should he easily display his joys and sorrows.
Things against all conscience. If he wants to survive.
Indeed, as a king, the hardships he faces daily go far beyond just this. During his unconscious state, a Danish fleet had already reached the western shores of Wales, and if left unchecked, they would soon reach the borders of Wessex. Preliminary estimates from scouts suggest the enemy numbers at least 1,000 warriors. Alfred had planned to confront the enemy himself, but Ub wished to resolve this crisis in his own way.
If you make me the head of the army, I will find a way of dealing with the Danes.
Meanwhile, Judith, who committed the grave act of killing her own child for the greater good, quickly faced divine retribution when she developed a breast disease, which was actually breast cancer. The doctors at the palace could do nothing about it, nor could the witch doctors outside. As Judith wallows in sorrow, a familiar voice echoes through the room. She approaches and sees the missing Lagertha, once a queen now fallen into destitution, deeply affected by Hemon's death. On the other side, Ub has already set out with his army. The invading enemy is a coalition of 3 Danish lords. To avoid unnecessary bloodshed, Ub decides to negotiate first. Upon learning that the emissary is Ragnar's son, the warriors beat their shields and chant Ub's name, indicating his fame has spread far and wide. Ub explains the situation to the 3 lords. The Vikings now have their own land, where they can live and prosper without worry for food or clothing, ensuring no more need for constant fighting for survival. After brief deliberation, 2 of the lords agree to the proposal, but a lord named Frodo refuses. Ub sees Frodo's refusal as a personal insult, thus challenging him to a duel. If Ub wins, Frodo's men will settle down. Otherwise, The trio will continue their attack on Hvitserk. The rule is the same as always, only one of them can leave alive. Not long into the battle, Ubb slices open Frodo's abdomen, but Frodo retaliates with a powerful punch, knocking Ubb to the ground. Ubb then slashes Frodo's right arm, but Frodo also lands a blow to Ubb's abdomen and head with the axe handle. Frodo's combo leaves Ubb seeing stars. Just as Frodo tries to disarm Ubb, Ubb swiftly gets up and tackles him, then pummels Frodo with heavy punches. Despite the powerful blows to his head, Frodo's resilience is strong. He still manages to throw Ubb off. Without his long sword, Ubb is forced to fend off the giant axe with a dagger. Speed is the dagger's advantage. Ubb cleverly slashes Frodo's forearm and quickly stabs Frodo's thigh, followed by a grapple and punches. Whether it's because of too much vegetarian diet in England or Frodo's high resilience, Ubb's continuous attacks hardly injure Frodo. The battle has drained both parties, relying solely on their strong will to continue the fight, but ultimately, Ubb is overpowered by the physically superior Frodo. Facing imminent defeat, Ubb prays to Odin for help. Both the scenario and the lines are so similar between father and son. Lager the once said that Ubb resembles Ragnar the most, both in looks and personality. Just as Frodo prepares to finish Ubb, Ubb suddenly rises swiftly, moves behind, and stabs Frodo to death with a backstab. Frodo's lieutenant tries to avenge him but is killed by Torvi, who was standing behind. Ubb wins the duel, and the two lords will lead everyone to settle in East Anglia. Though severely injured and unable to move, Ubb, who averted a war with his own strength, must surely be Ragnar's proudest son. Revenge mode began when Thorgrim killed Bull. Not long after, they discover Thorgrim in the hot springs. To prevent further bloodshed, Floki proposes sacrificing himself to appease the god's wrath, but the vote doesn't pass. Not only does the Kjetil family unanimously oppose it, but even Ivan's son disagrees.
You are more important to us alive.
Floki then gathers them once more and speaks from the heart. He essentially says that both families have each lost a son and can't afford more sacrifices, especially since the two families are intermarried. Kjetil's daughter Thorin is about to give birth, marking Iceland's first new life. Floki begs both sides to put aside their axes and live in peace for the sake of their shared future and this new life.
To the birth of a new child. Let us drink to the new child.
However, one day, the pregnant Thorin disappears. Helgi suspects his father killed her, but even Ivan wouldn't murder his pregnant daughter-in-law. Thorin disappearing without a trace makes no sense, as being alone in such harsh conditions is tantamount to death. On a stormy night, Floki sees Thorin's ghost. Yes, Thorin is dead. Her husband's brother, Asbjorn, smashed her head with a rock. She reveals the truth to Floki and points out where her body is buried. Indeed, they find Thorin's body where indicated, and her death brings both families to their knees in grief. However, the real culprit is Ivan's third son, Asbjorn. To punish their actions, Floki banishes them from the settlement. With winter approaching, their chances of survival outside are slim. Floki believes they no longer deserve sympathy, and Ivan tried to fight Floki in a duel, but he knew he had no advantage.
You could. But you would lose.
With no other choice, Ivan's family leaves. Then, as expected, winter arrives. One day, the also exiled Helgi visits, looking nearly frozen to death, and some of his fingers have necrotized. Due to the harsh conditions and lack of food, the exiled Ivan family is barely clinging to life. Aside from a few children who have died, the rest are bedridden. Helgi begs for help for his family. Floki first amputates his necrotized fingers. Then, they discuss whether to help them. Floki fears Ivan's return could disrupt their current peace, but Helgi argues that after enduring such hardships, his father has learned his lesson and they are all reflecting on their actions. Kjetil's opinion is crucial as a victim who lost both a son and a daughter. Surprisingly, Kjetil generously agrees to the rescue. So, they brave the harsh weather and finally reach Ivan's makeshift shelter. Seeing Kjetil put aside past grievances to help them, Ivan feels immense guilt and decides to start anew. Kjetil finally agrees with Floki's view that they've truly transformed from bloodthirsty barbarians to a community of love and kindness. But is that really the case? The next day, as everyone prepares to leave, Kjetil suddenly sheds his benevolent facade.
Come on, you old witch.
Why did you say that?
Because it's true. You're a witch and a murderess. And you deserve to die!
What are you doing?
In front of Floki, they slaughter all of Ivan's family.
Satan! This is madness!
No, I've thought about this a long time, Floki.
Please!
Only then does Ivan realize that Kjetil had always been a demon in disguise. Kjetil had been biding his time for this moment of revenge, never forgetting his children's brutal deaths. With this, Floki's last hope for light is extinguished. He thought they had escaped the cycle of conflict and killing. He thought they would be reborn in this new world. But human nature doesn't change easily, and Floki was wrong after all. The next day, Kjetil executes Ivan as if performing an execution, but Helgi was not only Kjetil's son-in-law but had always sided with Kjetil, yet they spared him no mercy. When everyone returns home, Aud senses something is wrong. After hearing Floki's recount, she breaks down. Kind-hearted Aud had always tried to mediate between the two families. She believed in Floki and in this new world, but her father was the ultimate demon, and their actions were not vengeance but massacre.
I should never have brought you onto this place.
The next day, disheartened, Aud ends her life by jumping off a cliff. A scene Floki happens to witness. After burying Aud, a dispirited Floki leaves to seek answers from the gods. He discovers a cave, but deep inside, he finds a crucifix. No wonder they hadn't received the god's protection. The deity Floki had been seeking was actually the Christian god. This ironic result caused Floki to break down and cry out in pain. Does this suggest that Christianity is the ultimate destiny for the Vikings? As a volcanic eruption causes the cave to collapse, Floki's Icelandic saga temporarily concludes. Floki's fate will be unveiled in Season 6. Ivar's son has finally been born. During her pregnancy, Freydis promised Ivar that their child would be a flawless godsend and named the baby Baldur. After Freydis gave birth smoothly, Ivar showed unprecedented happiness. However, Ivar's smile faded the moment he saw the child, as the baby boy was also born with a disability. Freydis, on the other hand, saw it as a miracle, claiming the baby inherited Ivar's traits, and even tried to convince Ivar that both father and son were divine. But Ivar wasn't fooled. He knew the child was someone else's. Yet, as a king, he could not let people suspect his infertility, nor could he be without an heir. Had the child been without flaws, it would have been a perfect ending to their story, but the child was also disabled, and Ivar didn't want his son to relive his own tragedy, to live amidst cold stares and mockery. So Ivar followed the example of his father, Ragnar, and left the child to die in the middle of nowhere. When Freydis discovered the child was missing, she was furious with him, but Ivar thought the child was far from the perfection Freydis had promised, so he was done playing along with her act.
Where is my baby?
Later, the hunters see the remains of a baby in a fox den, which Freydis assumes is the abandoned baby. Freydis was deeply disappointed in Ivar. After all her sacrifices, this was how he treated her. But before Freydis could finish, Ivar couldn't hold back any longer.
Is he really my son? Where's he? You see, I'm not so sure anymore. I'm not sure that poor crippled bastard was my son. Was he? You lied to me. You lied to me.
Ivar finally exposed Freydis' lies. Freydis has been bragging about him the whole time. Ivar had enjoyed the adulation, until the birth of the disabled child shattered all his illusions. Meanwhile, in Wessex, Lagertha began recalling her post-war experiences. After Hemun's death, Lagertha, with her injured leg, fled the battlefield. She had hoped to live as a farmer, but found herself constantly caught in battles and killings. She had grown weary of such a life. A kind-hearted witch doctor found and saved her, believing Lagertha's narrow escape from death marked a new beginning for her. The witch doctor helped her cut off her long hair. Friends often remarked that Lagertha never seemed to age, largely because she hadn't faced significant hardships. After losing Kattegat and 2 loved ones, the once radiant queen had finally lost her former luster. Not long after, Judith died from a worsening illness. Her affair with Athelstan and the birth of Alfred had cost her an ear, but protecting the future king became her sole mission. As Lager the said of Judith, although she did not wield weapons, she fought in her own way. Now that Alfred had secured his throne, Judith's mission was complete. On another note, Bjorn and Gunhild's wedding was completed. Harold could be considered the most magnanimous man. He watched the woman he loved marry someone else, provided them with the venue and resources, and even personally led the troops to help Bjorn attack Kattegat. Their fleet then set sail for Kattegat, but a storm along the way cost them many ships, infuriating Harold. Harold had planned to wait until after the stormy winter season, but Bjorn, impatient and believing in the gods' protection, pushed forward, resulting in significant losses. If it weren't for Bjorn's stubbornness, they wouldn't have lost so many ships. Harold thinks it's not worth it to cooperate with Bjorn. The woman is his, the throne is his, so he might as well cooperate with Ivar, who promises to give him the throne when he dies. The conversation got worse and worse, and they got into a fight. Gunhild intervened to stop the two men.
So why do you fight now? If you have to, fight later. Fight about Kattegat. Whatever else you want to fight about.
After hearing Gunhild out, they realized their immaturity. Meanwhile, Ub finally awoke, and Torvi told him nearly 3,000 Danes had been settled in East Anglia, all thanks to him, but Ub is preoccupied. In the final stages of the duel, it was the gods and the father who answered his call and made him victorious, and the Christian god gave him no indication of what to expect. So, he decides to leave this place and return to his true homeland to once again worship the gods. Seeing Ragnar's wishes fulfilled, Lager also decided it was time to return home, so they bid Alfred farewell and started their journey back. Outside the walls of Kattegat, Hvitserk and Bjorn unexpectedly met. After everything they had been through, the brothers stood together once again. This is the Blood Feud 2.0, the finale of Season 5. Friends often asked how Vikings could tell friend from foe in battle. It seems the director heard their queries, as this episode provided a distinction. The siege strategy involved dividing the troops to attack the city's two main gates from the left and right. Bjorn and Olaf led the white troops, while Harold and Hvitserk commanded the blue troops. Before going to war, Ivar wanted to be forgiven by Freydis. She was the only one who could make Ivar apologize. Now that his brothers have turned against him, Freydis' understanding as his only remaining relative is vital to him.
I love you, Freydis.
And I forgive you. And I love you too.
After Ivar took power, Kattegat's defenses were continuously upgraded, giving him confidence in repelling the attackers. The battle officially began with Bjorn leading the assault team straight to the city gates. Facing Bjorn directly was Ivar, who, under his command, had the archers unleash a barrage of arrows.
Archers!
On the other side, with the launch of two rockets, Harold initiated their attack. Since Floki's departure, their siege equipment was rudimentary at best. Battering rams, ladders, ropes, and poles, without even a catapult in preparation. Nonetheless, the agile Hvitserk was the first to scale the walls using a pole. Magnus, though claiming to be Ragnar's son, showed none of his previous bravery and prayed to God from under a cart. The arrival of the defense pavilion for the battering rams seemed timely, but Ivar had a countermeasure ready. As barrels of boiling oil were poured down, the siege's climax was just beginning, with warriors giving their last strength even as they were engulfed in flames. Witnessing this fratricidal scene, Olaf began to sing a passage from Twilight of the Gods.
Upon a shore of corpses, broken heads, spilled guts, scorched flesh. Come and see the young tearing each other's throats out.
On the other side, Ivar's lieutenant, White Hair, showed exceptional bravery. Despite having only one eye, his combat skills were formidable. After killing several enemies, White Hair even knocked Harold's weapon away with a single stroke. To save his life, Harold had no choice but to jump off the wall, and even with a pole to break his fall. He was severely injured. Seeing the tide turn, the clever Hvitserk immediately climbed down the wall using a rope. He asked Harold if it was time to retreat. As their current tactics clearly wouldn't breach the city, Harold wanted to wait a bit longer, hoping Bjorn might succeed, as he was still striving to breach the city gate. But Ivar had more tricks up his sleeve. They brought out a large bellows and started to fan the flames towards Bjorn's team. However, Bjorn and his siege team, despite the arrows and flames, finally managed to break through the city gate. But as they rushed in, they found the enemy had already set up a defensive stance at the entrance. The closing of the second gate cut off their forces like a guillotine, a trap designed by Ivar. The warriors who rushed in with Bjorn were like turtles caught in a jar. It was then that Bjorn despairingly realized that against Ivar's cunning and strategy, his bravery was worth nothing. As wave after wave of arrows rained down, Bjorn's warriors were slaughtered. Gunhild was hit by a stray arrow while climbing, but for the sake of rescuing her husband, this minor injury was negligible. Bjorn seized the opportunity to break through the encirclement, leading the few remaining warriors up the stairs and escaping with Gunhild's cover. Meanwhile, Magnus finally remembered he was Ragnar's son. Under Odin's protection, he believed he was invincible. Magnus then charged towards the city wall, ready to make a last stand, but was pulled back by Harold, who had ordered a retreat. Harold had always thought Magnus was an English spy, only realizing his mistake today. Magnus said he had just realized who he really was. He wanted to declare he was Ragnar's son, a descendant of Odin, but before Magnus could finish, Whitehair's arrow pierced through his chest. Whether Magnus was truly Ragnar's son wasn't important. What mattered was he always believed he was. So, would Bjorn and Harold simply accept defeat? Did they still have a chance to turn the tables?
You were the most beautiful thing that ever happened to me. I will always love you.
The defeat in this siege battle stirred a complex mix of emotions in Bjorn: anger, sorrow, and a sense of helplessness. So, with tears in his voice, Bjorn played the emotional card with his warriors.
We played together when we were children. I am not your enemy. Ivar is your enemy.
Bjorn spoke the truth, so the archers refused Ivar's command to shoot him down. Ivar snatched a bow and arrow to shoot at Bjorn himself, but fortunately, Bjorn was quick to block the arrow. After the battle, Ivar hanged those who disobeyed his orders. He told everyone he was willing to die for the people of Kattegat, but this required their loyalty in exchange. If they couldn't even offer that, they should be prepared to join him in death. Meanwhile, the defeated group returned to their camp, undeterred. Bjorn tries to keep attacking, but Olaf doesn't think they have any chance of winning. He thought every tactic they could imagine would be easily countered by Ivar. Harold also saw no point in continuing the fight. Combined, their brains were no match for Ivar's, especially now that they had lost more than half of their manpower. Taking advantage of Ivar's celebration, Fritis secretly visited the Allied camp at night. She revealed all of Ivar's misdeeds, including burning Thora alive, killing her newborn child, among other atrocities. Fritis hoped they could stop Ivar and was willing to help the Alliance invade Kattegat.
Thank you.
I want to see Ivar strung up in a tree.
At dawn the next day, Fritis opened a secret gate for the Alliance, a hidden passage designed by Ivar for escape. This effectively tore open a breach in an otherwise impregnable fortress, allowing the Allies direct access to Ivar's stronghold. That's why the emphasis on Ivar's apology is so important. Although Fritis appeared to forgive him, no mother could truly forgive the murderer of her own child. When Fritis returned home, the battle horns were already sounding. Fritis played dumb, telling Ivar that the enemies were attacking the walls again. Ivar scoffed at them for wasting their effort, unaware that the enemy was drawing nearer. After killing a few resistors, Bjorn ordered everyone to stop fighting. He came to settle accounts with Ivar, not to have innocent people sacrifice their lives.
Stay inside! Don't fight us! We are here to set you free! Ivar!
Seeing this, Ivar knew that the tide had turned and he realized that there was a traitor in his midst. Then under the cover of his escort, Ivar chose to go. But before he could escape, he had to deal with the traitor first. Only he and Freydis knew about the secret passage, and Freydis readily admitted to her actions.
I will always love you.
Ivar couldn't tolerate betrayal and strangled Freydis with his own hands, even though she was his beloved. Ironically, Freydis once strangled the man who borrowed her seat in order to get to the top, and now she's lost her throne in the same way. The fight outside the door was not over yet. Ivar's guard showed extraordinary combat skills, being the best of the best. At that moment, a berserker pressing a giant axe against Bjorn's body overwhelmed him, and Bjorn alone could not turn the tide. Harold watched, torn over whether to help Bjorn. After all, if Bjorn died, Kattegat and Gunhild would be his. Ultimately, Harold decided to help, only to be stabbed by an enemy. Fortunately, the wound was not fatal. By the time they entered the king's house, Ivar had long since fled, leaving Freydis in the bedroom, along with a few pieces of the baby's skeleton. Though they had only met once, Freydis' sacrifice moved Bjorn. Without her, the alliance would have had no chance of victory. Freydis gave Ivar, who had been mocked and humiliated from a young age, a warmth he had never felt before. Yet, she was also the key to his loss of the kingdom. Bjorn officially took over Kattegat, and coincidentally, Ub and others arrived home at this time. Lajertha's arrival was a delightful surprise for Bjorn.
You're alive.
And here's the Sword of Kings. Hail King Bjorn, King of Kattegat.
A mother-son reunion, brothers coming together, defeating a formidable enemy, and being crowned king. It was indeed a perfect ending to Season 5. As Bjorn sat alone on the peak of Kattegat with the king's sword, his father's teachings resurfaced.
Power is always dangerous. It attracts the worst and corrupts the best. Power is only given to those who are prepared to lower themselves to pick it up.
What exactly was the Dune Ragnar spoke of, and how would it descend upon them? See you in Season 6.